Thank you so much, Peter, for taking the time today and coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Been listening to your podcast for a while and definitely consider it one of the best in the crypto space, if not the best. I know you and Pomp have a little feuding, and I've had you both on the show now, so I got to be a little careful. A little
No,
friendly
you know
feuding.
that. Yeah, that's just friendly. That's me just teasing him. He's in terms of what he does, he's a superstar. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's been very successful, but I just like to wind him up.
Yeah, so I mean, I want to talk about your, all the stuff that you're doing. You're obviously putting out a ton of content as well, and it seems like it's rapidly growing. You've got, what Bitcoin did, and I want to talk about what Bitcoin's done. We're recording here on the 17th of December, and it's been a pretty wild 24 hours or so. We're sitting at around $23,500 per Bitcoin. But maybe a good place to start actually would be kind of talking about how you got started with the podcast in the first place. And we can kind of talk about some of that stuff. And I know now you have another podcast called Defiance. I saw you're actually launching another one soon, and as well as like a newsletter. So would love to hear kind of how this whole, suite of content has kind of come together for you over time.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because I probably should just focus on the Bitcoin podcast and just do that and be happy. But I'm just it's in me. I'm just somebody who likes to build businesses and I like growth, and so I just have this appetite to do more, to build a business, and also just to challenge myself. Bitcoin is great, but when you start to touch on sisters topics or other topics that you think people in Bitcoin might like, but take you into like a whole other areas of interest, it just broadens your kind of horizon and understanding of the different type of people out there. I think you can get very blinkered in the world of Bitcoin of, one kind of almost like uh, laser focused in a certain kind of like expectation of what you want to happen to the world, and you expect everyone else to think like you, but it's just not that way. So doing other types of content or topics, it just broadens my kind of scope of people I can talk to. It broadens my understanding of the world, and it just challenges me. So yeah, I just have this burning appetite to do other things.
And it seems like one of, you mentioned you have a number of interests outside of Bitcoin, and I could certainly appreciate that. Like Bitcoin has been fascinating for me over the last, I was paying attention for the last few years since, before the 2017 peak, but really in the last year started really getting on board. And fortunately, it seems like the timing for that was pretty good.
Nice.
So, it seems like you're also interested though in, as another category, maybe like controversial figures or people who may deserve to have their voice heard, in my opinion, and I think probably yours do deserve to have their voice heard. I think pretty much anyone deserves to be able to tell their story and have people listen and see for themselves what they think and gather the appropriate information and everything. Is that right, that that's kind of a special interest that you have, like speaking to some of the controversial people who may have been kind of dismissed by society but deserve to kind of tell their story?
Yeah, it's usually the story I'm interested in more than the person. And the person could be wrapped into the story. Like I was very interested in telling the story of Ghislaine Maxwell. Now that was produced by somebody else on Defiance, but I was very interested in telling that story because everyone has talked about the story from Jeffrey Epstein, but I just thought it was super interesting to look at it from her angle. How is this very kind of like successful socialite from the UK whose father was controversial, mostly successful publisher, but in the end was a bit of a criminal. How did she end up becoming complicit in what appears to be, some very serious crimes against young women? And I really wanted to tell that story. I thought that was interesting, but it is always a story. Like I say, I was really interested this year in what's going on in the U.S. elections. Yeah, I'm always drawn to the story, usually more than the person, but sometimes there are also individuals I do want to tell the story of as well. It's a mixed bag, but it's it. I guess I just see something and I think I want to look into that. I want to research that and make a story about that. I also did one about this heavy metal band, which was completely off track. This band were in a bus crash when was it, 5 years ago, and they took 4 years to get back on stage. The driver died, the drummer lost his leg. But to me, it was a fascinating story. So yeah, I'm drawn to stories, man.
And did you have like a background in any of this before the podcast and, digging into stories? And I'm just curious, like, when you started with what Bitcoin did, as your first, brand that really hit it hard, like what brought you to that in the first place? I guess what brought you to Bitcoin as the first area of interest specifically? And then secondarily, like podcasting as the medium.
Yeah, so I've told this story a few times. So Bitcoin itself was, you know, it came into my life a couple of times. I heard about it in 2017. I used it on the Silk Road. I traded a bit on CFD website, but never really spent any time like understanding what Bitcoin is or what it means. I had no idea it was like some special decentralized currency. I had no idea of the Austrian economics and all the kind of ideas that people have, regarding fiat money. It just never crossed my mind. It was a tool for me to use, and then and then I forgot about it. And then about at the end of 2016, start of 2017, I discovered it again, and this time it was a time in my life where I had nothing on. I quit work. I was spending time with my mother who was sick, and I discovered it again. But this time I went a little bit deeper, and just by a weird series of events, I ended up at some retreat in Italy. Spent a lot of time with this podcaster named Rich Roll, very successful podcaster. He's a vegan ultra athlete. And I met up with him again in Los Angeles, and I said to him, I'm thinking of doing a podcast. Like, how do you do it? And he told me, and bought the equipment and just went off and made my first episode. And there's never really been a plan up until recently. Originally, it was just a podcast, not a business. It became a business over the last kind of 18 months. But just released one show and then another show, and here we are 3 years later, and I've probably across both podcasts done over 350 episodes. But look, how many shows have you done now, Jake?
This is probably like my 35th recording. I launched 31st today.
Yeah, so you did your first one and you did your second. Here you are at 35, and before you know it, 3 years will have passed and you'll have done a couple of hundred. It just kind of happens that way, and it's a strange thing, really, isn't it?
Yeah, they definitely start to fly by, and it's an interesting thing because like it's such a unique thing to do. I mean, everything's unique in a certain way, but the fact that I'm not doing this for money at this point, I certainly hope to monetize it at some point in the future with like a big enough following and everything like that. But and it sounds like it took you some time to kind of get there as well. But the fact that you can do this and just kind of have conversations with people that you're interested in, and a ton of people can listen, not just like while you're talking, but basically for all of eternity, as long as like these podcast platforms are up and the streaming, the episode itself stays up. It's just a pretty wild concept that like myself, I came from like a financial background, totally nothing related to any of this. I mean, I guess the Bitcoin piece overlaps a little bit, but in terms of like being a creator and generating money on the internet and everything like that, it's a totally different world. And I've just been fascinated. Like you said, the first 10 episodes were like one at a time, a lot of focus. Kind of, I don't know if it's like this for you, but it's quite nerve wracking heading into each episode, because like I have some stuff prepared, but at the same time, you want to be spontaneous. So there's all this stuff that goes into the podcast. But like you said, I'm 35 episodes in now, and they just start to really flow by, and I'm just kind of, taking them one step at a time, but flowing through them pretty quickly. As you kind of launch the Defiance one, and then this next one that you're going to launch as well. I don't know if you've released what it's necessarily about. I just saw the tweet from a few days ago. What was your mindset on like, doing those as separate brands rather than folding it into one thing and calling it, maybe you change the name from what Bitcoin did to, naming it after yourself or something like that?
Yeah, see, I've wrestled with this a lot. Sometimes I wish I'd have just called it the Mccormack Show to begin with, because then I could have just done anything I wanted, right? I could have just had any interviews I wanted to do, but because it was what Bitcoin did, the show kind of has to be about Bitcoin, and it's been successful because of that. A few times I've thought of changing it. I've always come back and thought, no, stick with it. It's a Bitcoin show. You've got one of the biggest shows. Just stick with it. But there is this difficulty where if somebody doesn't know Bitcoin or doesn't understand Bitcoin, they can be quite dismissive of it. So I just felt like I needed to separate the two things. One is a show which is about Bitcoin, but really is also a bit about me because it's the way I drive the show. But Defiance, I wanted it to be like a media brand which is separate from me. I've brought on other producers, other people are producing work for that, and generally the idea is just to build up essentially a media company. Go from a podcast to a media company. I'm hoping, like you noted, I'm hoping to launch a third podcast this year. It's going to be a technology one, but looking again, there will be the crossover with Bitcoin, but kind of more some of the weird things that are going on with technology, AI stuff, dystopian surveillance stuff. Bitcoin will be in there as well, and I just feel like that'd be a nice extension of the brands. And I'm also hopefully launching an email brand. Well, I am in February as well. But yeah, I guess I'm just building up a team and a company, and which is kind of, it's always been my way of just naturally trying to build things.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I saw you brought are you bringing Willy Woo on board to help out with the team as well?
Yes, so I've got three. I've got Willy Woo, Lynn Alden, and Shinobi all coming on to kind of help with the show. Because what I wanted to do is have some regular people on to cover specific subjects. And the idea is I have a Bitcoin show, but if you think of a podcast can really be like a TV channel or a radio station rather than a single show. Essentially, you own the platform and what comes out on it. It's, if you think like TV channels, they have a range of shows on them, right? And you can do the same with a podcast. So it was kind of taking it to that next step, whereby I can start having shows that come out on the same feed, but are things that people can attach themselves to. A bit like, look, Rogan's been brilliant at this. He does his MMA shows and he does his normal shows. He does his other bits, and I never listen to the MMA. I've got no interest, but I will listen to his other interviews. And I think perhaps that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this. Maybe there's some people who don't like my show, but will listen to the tech ones. But now they've got a regular monthly tech update. So yeah, I mean, it's just to try and expand out what the show does, and the content I'm putting out there.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think I've personally thought about the channel, comparison, and kind of I'm almost surprised even that there hasn't been some collaboration where people have come together to create, a series of podcasts, or like a curation of podcasts where, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you go to the channel and you can trust that they're curating content that you're interested in if you like that channel in general. And it might be, some of your podcasts, some of Pomp's podcasts, some of Rogan's podcasts, whatever it is. And you might not be interested in whatever's on at that time, and you can tune into something else, and might not be great to tune in the middle of the podcast, but it's a very new medium still. Rogan's been doing it for what, 10 or 15 years, maybe. I'm not exactly sure, but he's the number one in the world. And, it's a pretty simple thing. He's sitting in his studio. The audio, the visual is pretty basic. The audio is pretty comparable to what you and I are doing right now. And so I think podcasts have a ways to develop, and anyone who's kind of exploring to see what that might be, I think it's definitely pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space, and it's very competitive now. There's a lot of podcasters in the space that have come out over certainly this last few months since COVID started, but also the last year. So I think sometimes you have to also innovate. I'm always trying to innovate what I do. Another thing, going back to what you were saying earlier about where you said about you prep questions and sometimes you just let it flow. It is a craft. You can't just put on, press the start button, start asking questions and recording and have a conversation. But also, there is a craft to it. If you want to develop it, you can work on your craft. You can work on the structure of your interviews. Maybe you work on a style of maybe teasing people, like teasing certain information out of people. I spent time looking and studying how other interviewers work, and I am self-critical, and I just think it's not a bad thing to keep looking at what you're doing and try and reinvent yourself.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's certain consistent threads that, you can latch onto. Like, so for you, it seems to me like, I don't know you from like from everyday life or anything like that, but it seems that you're like very real on the show and no BS. And that's certainly like a big part of how I think about it too. Like I could certainly put on like a super, whatever uppity kind of voice and like make it into like a whole scene. But it's like, I'd rather just have like a pretty straightforward conversation with people. And I think it leads to like a more genuine kind of set of subjects too. And people share like their honest perspectives. What do you think, like, on the subject of refining your craft? You've been doing this for at least a couple of years now, like you said. What are a few of the things that, you've really kind of tried to find the balance with? And if that's a little bit too vague, I can give you like an example
No,
of
no,
some of the things I
I
think
know what
of.
you're saying. So when I first started, I used to have all my questions in advance ready, uh, and then what I'd find myself doing is focusing on the questions and not on the guest and missing the conversation. So then I switched it up to then have just go into an interview without anything prepped, knowing what I want to talk about. Um, but with that, then I found that I missed some topics I wanted to cover. So now I kind of have a mix. I have a dual screen setup. And doing, because I used to do a lot of my interviews in person, which is very difficult to do with the list of questions in front of you. Now, when you're in front of a computer screen, I can have my questions on one screen and I'd be talking to the person through the other screen. But now I'm trying to build really solid, good interviews that people just really enjoy. So I've realized I have to go back to doing a lot of preparation now. But that's something I've wrestled with back and forth with that. Also, length of shows. Sometimes, I can record with somebody for 3 hours and really enjoy it. And then another time I can be 30 minutes in and thinking, God, I can't wait for this to end. Trying to get the timing and the quality of the interview right. It is a real challenge. I would say to people, like some people just go, "Oh, it's so fucking easy what you do." I'd say go and try it. It isn't as easy as you think to produce something which sounds good, which is engaging, which is entertaining, and to cover all the tech stuff. If you think it's easy, go and try it because it isn't.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, it's first of all, it's refreshing to like hear that perspective from you. We're thinking about a lot of the same things, and obviously you've done it and it's worked for you already, or at least it's shown a lot of traction, so far. Some of these trade-offs and I think of it all as like trade-offs, right? So you talk about like the amount that you're going to prepare, and like the episode length; those correlate with or negatively, I guess, with the frequency that you release podcasts as well. If you're going to prepare 5-6 hours per podcast, you can't record 3 a day, and maybe that's a little bit extreme, or maybe you have some other stuff that you have to do or whatever it is. But I definitely started off the same way as you. I think it's for me it was like I'm not going to like make a fool of myself, so I'm going to prepare, and I'd much rather over prepare. But since then I haven't gone the exact extreme opposite of doing the not like no preparing really, and just kind of going with the flow thing. But I've
Yeah,
definitely tried to find like the medium, and I think Rogan talked about it actually pretty well. He called it like a dance, and it's tough, and every partner is different, and there's no one formula to get it right.
yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. The dance. Also, it is a good interview. Is actually mentally tiring. Um, I don't know if you've ever had it, but you've come off one. You've just got to have a little walk, have a bit of a breather. So doing two in a day is doable. Again, challenging. I can't do three in a day. If I try and do a third one, the third one will suffer. I think one a day is optimum, but I can do, like I said, I can do two if needed. Have you ever done three in a day?
No, I've never done 2 in a day.
Oh,
And frankly, like one of the ways I look at it that's a little bit different, I think, is that, and this is another set of trade-offs, but I know that at this point, at least, no one cares. No one's tuning in because of me. People are tuning in because of my guests, and I've been very fortunate to get awesome guests like yourself. And so I focus on really, appeasing the guest as much as the audience. And sorry for everyone listening, but I want to feed the guest questions, not to like, just totally sugarcoat them or whatever it is, like lay up stuff. I want them to say, like, I started my interview with Roger Veer. I asked him what it was like, on his first day of jail. And that was my first question out of the gates. And I thought it was probably one of the best interviews I've started so far. So like, I'm not letting anyone off the hook, but at the same time, I'm trying to do like diligent preparation and everything like that. And it feels to me that, to do 3 podcasts in a day certainly is just like, at that point, I'm kind of just a machine, and like, it's not as thoughtful maybe. And, no offense to anyone who's doing that, but I do think that, like, at the very least, I think it's worth like committing a large part of my day to the guest that's willing to come on it and share the time with me.
Yeah, it's a good point you've made. But one of the things that I kind of realized with doing this is that, like, I'm ambitious. I want to get bigger interviews. I want to interview, more high profile people, and yeah, a lot of that comes down to the downloads. If you've got a popular show, it becomes a bit easier. And one of the things I was kind of looking at with other people is like, why, you know, Rogan can get Edward Snowden on and he will get 10 million downloads. I could get Ed Snowden on and I'll get 30,000. I doubt I would, but I might even do a better interview. But just for the sake of argument, let's say I can do a better interview.
Yeah,
The
no,
reason he's getting
I totally get where you're going. Go ahead though.
Yeah. So, well, what I'm getting at is like people have bought into Rogan, like as a person, a brand, who he is, what he stands for. So, whilst I agree with what you're saying, I think at some point, Jake, you've got to bring your personality out and have people buy into you. Like, not everyone buys into me, of course, that's impossible to do. But I think what I've tried to do is say, look, this is my focus, my style. I am somebody who is particularly interested in certain topics. I'm not dogmatic about anything. I don't understand a lot of the detail of what people are doing. So I'm just going to come in as this kind of like innocent, curious guy with a bunch of questions. And when you tell me something I don't understand, I'm going to say, explain it. And I've essentially built a brand around that. So my focus really, like after a while, what was to have people kind of buy into what I'm doing. And I think you're going to have to probably consider doing something similar.
Yeah, and I might have kind of misspoke or miscommunicated a little bit earlier. I actually totally agree with what you're saying. I think, I'm 30 episodes in. So anyone who comes and listens to my 5th episode, unless it's like my mom or my girlfriend, she's coming for the guest. But, later on, you certainly have to, I think you get people in the door for the guest, and maybe, they don't come back, not for any particular reason, but they kind of have their podcast that they already like and listen to. But then they see another guest and they come back and they're like, I've listened to this podcast twice now. I actually really like it. Now I'm going to subscribe. Now I'm going to come listen to this guy and, have, all of his episodes on my feed. And just like Rogan, I doubt there's too many people. I certainly wouldn't want to listen to all of his episodes. He's a machine, and he puts out, 2-3 hour episodes like 4 or 5 times a week. But I listened to a lot of his episodes, like you said, and I've never listened to an MMA. I listened to like a Snowden or a Kanye West. So I think there's actually a really interesting conversion that happens over time, where as you do, like you mentioned, it's, in the beginning, it's not as much about the quality of the episode. It's about like strictly what your base kind of already is. And so even if you do a better interview with Snowden, more people are going to listen to Rogan because he's got a bigger platform. And over time you can kind of develop that platform, I think. And it sounds like that's what you're saying, where over time, it's more and more dependent on the host and less dependent on the guest.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Do you do 1 or 2 a week?
Podcasts, like recording?
Yeah.
I've recorded pretty much between like 1 and 4 since I've started. Typically,
no, I mean released.
2 or 3.
Like, do you have a release day, or do you just release them when they're done?
Pretty much, I've been trying to do Tuesdays and Thursdays, but
Yeah.
it's, when you stick to like a specific time, it's actually easier for me to just like record 2 a week than to post them at the specific time, especially because I get the guest's approval and have them listen. And I could probably skip that, but again, it's just kind of trying to treat my guests with some respect.
What have you found? Is there anything you've found particularly challenging yourself with it all?
I think the biggest thing for me, which we kind of touched on earlier, is, and I should say it's pretty fun to have the interview turned around. This hasn't happened really before, but it's interesting to me finding the balance in preparation, because I had, so like some of my earlier guests I was excited about, Vitalik came on for the 4th episode.
Wow.
Keith Raboy came on for I think the 13th episode, I spoke with Balaji recently as well. Those are some guys who like were at the very top of the list of people that I wanted to have on the podcast. I was fortunate to get them early. And like, I'm going to spend a lot, I'm already very familiar with their perspectives and I've consumed a lot of their content, and kind of studied, the things that they're interested in. Um, but when I have them on the show, I got to get fresh and I got to be on top of my game. And so for like a top guest that I care about, I'm spending multiple days, if not almost a week, like digging in and just kind of getting in their brain basically. And I'm way over
Dude,
prepared.
episode 4 getting Vitalik, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So,
That must have felt good.
yeah, it was really cool. And, I can't thank him enough, he's been helpful in a couple of ways, actually. And, coming on, like, he's just a really good dude. I think, I don't know, have you talked to him at all or on your podcast?
Yeah, I have. So I clash with him a little bit because I tend to clash with people
I
with
saw the,
stupid.
the loan thing.
No, that was a joke. I actually emailed him afterwards, and I said, "You do realise this is just a bit of fun and games." And he replied back. He said, "Yeah, it's just some fun." He gets it. Like it's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
the Twitter banter. No, I clashed with him on some things on Twitter before. I actually wrote to him and apologized. I said, "You know what? I called that wrong, and I'm sorry." And then he's been on the show twice. He had a debate with Samson Mao, and then I did a tech show about Ethereum versus Bitcoin. And I'm going to have him on again just to talk about Bitcoin. I'd love to get his insights into Bitcoin. I think he's a fascinating person. Whether I agree with Ethereum or not is irrelevant. Just as an individual, he's fascinating the way he thinks and what he's trying to do. I'm not a fan of Ethereum, but those getting those big guests, landing those that it's a really good feeling, isn't it? When you get somebody say yes, I'll do it. Somebody, because I don't know about you, but you get a lot of no's, or you get the blanks where you've emailed them and there's no reply. I mean, I had a lot of those, and that never ends, by the way, because all you ever do is you go up the food tree trying to get more and more high profile people. But it's a good feeling when you get a big interview that you've been looking for.
Oh yeah, it's awesome, and I think if I've been successful in any area, like I like to think that I do a good interview. But certainly, like from an objective standpoint, people have been pretty surprised by the guests I've had on in my first 30 episodes or so. And I could even probably be a little more restrictive, but I have certain people on that I'm just interested in. Like I'm interested, I guess, in more people than the caliber that I'm willing to have on in terms of like their following and notoriety at this point, because of what we talked about. Like at this early stage, people are coming for the guests, but I'm looking forward down the line to opening that up a little bit more and, being able to speak with, friends first and foremost, and just people who, aren't well known, and actually flipping the script a little bit where no longer am I kind of having the name bring people into the podcast and their following bring it in, but actually trying to pass my following on to people that I can kind of discover.
Yes, I think it's a fascinating thing to also just test yourself. Yeah, because one of the things you have to do is if you're going to be a podcaster and do a lot of interviews, you have to have a lot of broad knowledge, a lot of broad questions, and also some thick skin. I mean, I don't know if you're in that area where you get criticism yet, but when people can be really critical, and that can be a challenge to deal with that. When you're doing an interview, I don't listen back to mine anymore. I used to, and I just used to frustrate me. I was like, why the hell did I say that? Or why didn't I ask this? And, and other people listen to it and they're like, oh, you're an idiot. Why didn't you ask that? But it's a real challenge to go through all these different broad subjects and to be able to do the guests justice by being prepared, by giving them an engaging conversation. I always like talking to other podcasts. It's just to hear the journey they're going through as well, because we're kind of all in this together in some way.
Yeah, and I mean, in the one sense we are, in the other sense, I can, I'm one of those new guys as of, a few months ago that you mentioned. The podcast world seems to be just growing like crazy. And even since I've started mine, I feel like I keep seeing so many people who are starting a podcast. The way I try to think about it is that, if podcast is kind of the audio form of a website, or at the very least like a blog, it's very hard to imagine the number of people out there consuming, both now and in the future. And so, it would be like in, maybe 1999 or 2002 or whatever, year. I wasn't really of age at that point, but it would be like saying, oh, there's too many blogs now to be popular. And it's just like, that's kind of, in retrospect, ridiculous. If you keep it up and become one of the stronger ones over time, you know, you'll gain a following, and there's plenty of people out there. So I definitely try to take a perspective, which it sounds like you do as well. And you know, you can tell from your banter with Pomp and everything like that, that, you know, there's some, uh, it's reasonable to be kind of cooperative, and podcasters help podcasters. At the end of the day, you're only going to know, you know, a handful or a dozen or whatever. And there's thousands and, you know, maybe hundreds of thousands out there. And so might as well help your team kind of grow along with you. I'm curious, you know, just really digging into like the nitty gritty on the podcast process on your end. You mentioned like you don't listen to the podcast anymore afterwards. That's something I've still been doing. Partly just, you know, curiosity and to know. Sometimes I get off a podcast, I'm like, that was like, you know, not a great one. And then I'll listen and I'll be like, oh wow, that was actually like pretty solid. And on the other hand, sometimes I get off and, you know, when you just like have a really, you know, whether the audience likes it or not, you just kind of crushed it in your own mind and had a really great conversation with someone, super interesting topics. They really, you know, got very sincere in responding and everything like that. And so I'll get off and I'll be pumped, and then I'll listen back and I'm like, you know, it's pretty good. But you don't really listen anymore, it sounds like. So where, you know, so that's like an hour for every podcast that I record. That's, you know, that's a significant part of the process.
Do you engineer them yourself?
Yeah, I don't really do very much editing at all, though. Ideally, I do none. I just cut the beginning, put intro and outro music. I don't do any like you know, I don't talk before to the audience or anything like that. Like, this is going to start when I said, like, you know, thanks Peter for coming on the show and everything like that. So it's low maintenance. And personally, when I listen to podcasts, I just kind of skip that part anyway. So I just want to get right to the conversation. And if anyone else out there kind of appreciates that style, then that's kind of the way I roll. And on the other side, it saves me time. I don't have to do any editing or anything like that. So that's one area where I definitely save time.
Well, because I have a producer works full time for me now. Once the show's done, it goes to him, and he lets me know if he thinks I've done something good or not done something so well. It's that thing where you hate hearing your own voice. Like, everyone suffers from it. It's
that's
like you hear
tough,
your own
though.
voice.
That's tough for a podcaster.
It's so tough. You're like, God, I sound like an idiot. Who the hell listens to me? So I just can't stand to hear my own voice. So I can't listen back to mine because it just frustrates me. So my engineer does it, and I trust him now. Another thing I did is I stopped listening to other podcasts about Bitcoin. I stopped that about a year ago because I found myself listening to all of them, and I found they were influencing what I was doing and the decisions I was making about who to interview. And I didn't want that. I wanted to just go on my own journey. So like, I just stopped listening to other podcasts now. And what I tend to do is listen to podcasts which are on other topics. So because I want to learn more about from other interviewers, their kind of style, what they're doing. And so, yeah, there's a few things I've done to just approach things differently.
Do you listen to podcasts with your guests before they come on as a part of your preparation?
That's a tricky one. Usually not, unless I need to specifically for a bit of research. So if I'm doing a specific subject and they've talked about that subject, then I will do to help prep. But otherwise, no, I'll avoid it. I kind of want to produce unique pieces of content, so I avoid that. Why, is that something you do?
Oh yeah, 100%. And it's an interesting, you know, contrast there. I think we've been in line on a lot of things. For me, the reason is that people like Vitalik, you know, well, Vitalik might not be a great example because he actually has the blog where he does a fair bit of writing. But someone who doesn't have an outlet besides like maybe Twitter, which you can certainly scan Twitter for some questions. But I find the podcast people share things that sometimes they even forget they've shared if it's like a few years ago. And if you kind of catch them off guard with something that, you know, is kind of interesting and that they are kind of curious how you even know about it, I think one, you know, it reflects positively on myself, you know, in the guest's perspective. And I think whenever that happens, it actually makes for a better interview. It's not like a selfish thing. Like partly I would love the guest to think I'm great and everything like that. But on the other hand, like, I think the more they kind of appreciate the work you've done in advance and everything like that, the better they like, the more engaged they are, and the better the actual conversation kind of ends up being. So that's kind of my thoughts on listening to the podcast in advance. Where do
Yeah.
you get your questions? Is it how much of it is based on like uh, researching kind of relentlessly the guest versus the latter half, which is something that I kind of underallocate, I think, which is kind of just sitting down and thinking like, all right, what's interesting to talk with this person about?
Yeah, so I approach it differently. I usually know the topic and I'm pretty sure of the show title before I do the recording. Um, I so for example, I'll get my list up because I have my schedule here. So for example, I've got an interview coming up with. Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. So this is a yeah. So sorry, just bear with me. Yeah, I'm doing an interview with Breedlove in January, and it's the sovereign individual. We're going to cover that topic. So I'm reading that book and keeping notes as I like read it, and then I'm going to put those notes into a structure. But my notes will be based around the questions of that I want to put to him. Say, okay, you believe in X, so tell me how that happens. How does that work? It might be a case of I do an interview with Dan Hill. Say I'm going to do Bitcoin versus gold. He's done an email about that today. I'll go and read that email and then I'll put that into a structure. But I want whereas Rogan, someone like Rogan released an interview. He says I've interviewed this person and they're an expert in A, B, and C. Mine tend to be, oh, I'm a here's the subject, here's the guess, but it's going to be entirely based on that subject. And I want it to feel like people are listening. They're going to be taken on a journey for a specific subject, ideally.
Yeah, that's very interesting and definitely very different. And it actually makes sense going back to like one of the things we started with, which I said, like, I kind of assumed that you were interested based on some of your podcasts that you're doing on Defiance in somewhat controversial characters. And you were like, actually, no, I'm interested in, these stories and, having them talk about it. And it sounds like the same goes for, all of your podcasts. You actually pick the subject first and foremost, and obviously it's based on the guest to some degree, but you just kind of want to talk about a specific subject or topic or story, and then this is a really good person to talk about it with.
Yeah, well, yes, it can be mixed. It can be just people I do want to talk to. So, for example, I'd love to interview Eric Weinstein. I think it'd be a great interview, and I would pick the subject afterwards after I'd book someone like him. Um, but yeah, more often than not, I am led by the story I want to tell. Or the particular topic, but that usually is driven by. It's not a case of I just want to do a subject. That does happen, but what will happen is someone will write an article or release a book about a particular subject, and I'm like, yeah, that's a really good topic. Right, I want to cover that, and I want to cover that with you. So, for example, I interviewed Nick Bartia recently because he's releasing a book called Layered Money. It was a great interview. I also did another one about the book The Fourth Turning, which Brandon Quittem wrote a tweet thread about. Um, but I'm drawn to the subject mostly, but it's not always. Like, there are certain guests I want to get as well.
Yeah, it makes sense. I do want to talk about Bitcoin. I think people would be disappointed if they tuned in and they didn't get any of that, especially on a day like today. But before I kind of shift topics and on the subject of like, not picking one topic, I tend to kind of go at least to a few. Today, it sounds like we're going to have at least a couple. But last question on like the podcasting front. I heard you say, I think it was in the podcast with Pomp, which was really cool. You guys both kind of did it and launched it on your own platforms and everything. I think it was there that you were talking about, how ultimately your goal was really be able to do whatever the hell you want,
Yeah.
and be able to say whatever the hell you want and talk to whoever the hell you want and not have to worry about like being canceled. Those are kind of my words, maybe not yours, but why can't you kind of do that? From my perspective, like I have a long way to get to the level that your podcast is at now from where I am. But from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're at the level where you can do that. Do you feel that you can't?
Well, yes and no. I mean, financially, you have to be careful. My podcast is a business. Now that that doesn't really stop me doing what I want, because I can be quite reckless at times and get into fights and arguments over stupid things. But I think I call it completing the game, to be financially in a position whereby you've got enough money to take you through to the end of life, allows you to then have complete control over, firstly, your time. I think that's the most important thing. Like every day, pretty much I can get up and do what I want, which is a great thing. I mean, I work, but like if I want to get up tomorrow morning and go to the gym, I can go to the gym. I can just do that. That's really important to me, having that control of your time. Um, I I do though have run it as a business. I do have staff, so I have to hit a certain turnover. So I do have to be considerate about that. I can't be completely reckless. But eventually, you want to be in that position where no one can cancel you. That would be amazing. People have tried to cancel me a few times, 3 times this year, which I've survived. But it's not a fun thing to go through, because people put pressure on. Again, we talk about Rogan a lot, but he's kind of like the top of the tree, the person we all look to and see what he's doing. Yeah, he hasn't had it plain sailing with Spotify. There's episodes that have supposedly been censored and such, and he can't be cancelled, but he's put in a tricky position. And I know a lot of people, especially in the Bitcoin world, they want everything to be totally free speech, and I understand and support that. But at the same time, I think I am. There's certain things I don't do, which maybe in hindsight is a good thing. Certain things I don't do because I do want to keep my business growing, and I do want to support my team and make sure they've still got a job next year.
Right. So you talk about, having an amount in your, I don't know if you have like a specific amount in your head that you kind of need to really not care anymore about, what you say or what you do, for better or worse, it sounds like. Obviously, Bitcoin is a part of the path to getting you there, and it sounds like a big part, given that you're taking out a loan to buy even more of it. 23,500 today. I actually, I don't have it up in front of me right now. For all I know, it's at like 26,000 as we're talking. But what do you think, what's going on right now? You called an all-time high this year. Now it's happened. We're up like 100% in the last 2 months, I think it is. I have my own thoughts on where this is going to end up in the next year, and then obviously the longer term vision as well. Would love to hear kind of, I've heard you obviously talk about your thoughts on Bitcoin before, and I'm sure everyone has, but given where we are, like as of today, any changes, any kind of refined perspective?
No, I'm so fucking bullish, dude. Honestly, I'm so bullish. Everything is played out exactly as expected, really, more or less. We've had a very challenging year with what's happened with COVID, but also just general unrest. The world feels like it's a very tense place right now. So everything in terms of like the economics has been set up perfectly for Bitcoin. That's not, by the way, that's not a great thing. That means that if this all plays out as some people predict, there's going to be a lot of pain for some people as we see sovereign currencies inflate quite heavily. But that's most likely going to happen. I've been so ultra bullish this year because there's so many things that have just kind of clicked for me with Bitcoin. One of the big things that clicked was like, I used to think before, I'm going to buy it and then, I'll sell it at this price. When it gets here, I'll sell some. I don't think like that anymore. I'm thinking of a place where I don't ever have to sell my Bitcoin. My Bitcoin is just something I use and spend. Therefore, to me, it's just a long-term, right now it's a savings technology until it becomes more of a medium of exchange. But I myself am I've seen other people do this. I'm like, what are you doing for? I now don't want to hold pounds or dollars. I want to hold Bitcoin. I'd like to get to a place where I'm only paid in Bitcoin. It's the best form of money. It's the one I want to hold. I don't want to hold. If I've got excess pounds in my bank, I'm converting them to Bitcoin. This is where the loan came about. Some people are like, oh, he must be broke if he's doing that. It's not. I've been buying Bitcoin all year. There was a dip. I was like, shit, I want to buy some more. What loan can I get instantly? And I went onto my bank, and straight away they said they'll within 5 clicks we'll lend you £35,000. Like, great, taking it. Give it to me straight away. And I bought immediately, very confident of where the price is going. It's been an impressive few days. I could see us, 23 and a half is interesting. Will we carry on going up? We could do, or will it might even dip back down to 20. Who knows? But my long-term conviction is very strong. It's because the people coming into the market now there's a lot of people coming in now who aren't thinking about when they're going to sell it. These people who are buying 100 million, 500 million of Bitcoin, they're not here to sell. They're hodlers. Now, they're here to hold that Bitcoin for the long term. And that's also setting off this kind of chain reaction where lots of other companies and funds are thinking, well, if they're doing it, why aren't we? Should we do it? Let's have a look at it. Okay. Yes, I think we should do this. And that's why I think so much money is coming into it. So my conviction is very strong. I wouldn't be surprised of $100,000 Bitcoin next year at all.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised either. I did a pretty, I used a few different methodologies, some my own and some others, like the stock to flow by what's his name, Plan B.
Plan B.
And that's, he has like $288,000, I think, pinned. Everything I did came somewhere between like 60,000 and 300,000, and that's like a huge range. But even from where we are today, that's like 3x minimum, and you're talking about a year or so timeline. Phenomenal investment. I think the place where you and I may differ a little bit, hearing your perspective just now, and also obviously a bunch of times before, is I'm a little bit wary of any existential risk to Bitcoin, whether that's something that is known now or even can be known now. Just because of the newness of it. It's 10 or 11 years old now. I don't know what happens if China says to a group of experts, here's $1 trillion, go either kill Bitcoin or get us control of it. I'm a little bit scared of like the possibility of a 51% attack, which I think could be done for far less money than that. Do you have any concern of a total fail case for Bitcoin? And I'm not going for like a soundbite or anything like that. You don't have to even answer if you don't want to, but I'm just
No,
curious.
it's a great question. Look, there are people out there who would be better at answering that for me. I guess I'm aware the risks exist. Will China try and attack and take down Bitcoin? Will governments try and ban it? But I'm less concerned these days. I don't care about the bans anymore. I don't think Bitcoin's going to be banned. It might be heavily regulated, but I don't see it banned. And what I actually see is a very, very strong, large, tough, and resilient group of people behind Bitcoin. And I believe if anyone did try and attack it, they would find a way of defending it because they have time and time again. So I just don't see I don't see a scenario where if Bitcoin becomes widely adopted that China would try and destroy it, because that's potentially declaring war. I just don't see that scenario. But if it does, I would be confident that the people who work on Bitcoin would be able to defend that attack. I don't know
Right.
how, but I would be confident. Does it mean a change into, again, I would want somebody who understands this, like a Jimmy Song. Does it mean a change to the mining algorithm? Does it mean a change to the equipment? Does Bitcoin go offline for a couple of days? That I don't know. If anything, I'm more worried about the implication of Bitcoin going offline for a few days because it has to defend an attack rather than the attack itself, because suddenly there's no money. Suddenly there's no money. And that is a scenario I'm not prepared for. But no, I'm not worried anymore. I used to worry myself to not invest, and now I'm all in.
Yeah, and I, don't get me wrong, I'm mostly in the same boat as you in that I have a lot of my net worth in Bitcoin. In terms of a percentage, it's actually not that much money. But I'm also relatively young and appreciate that, you know, it depends on a person's risk tolerance as well as their understanding of Bitcoin. And you obviously have a very sophisticated understanding and, a pretty tall risk tolerance. So, I think for anyone to tell anyone to like put all their money in Bitcoin or put 10% of their money in Bitcoin just blindly, I think doesn't make a lot of sense. But for anyone to take either of those strategies, pretty much anything besides 0% allocation to Bitcoin, I think is reasonable. And anyone who thinks 0% is reasonable, guys like you and I can probably have a pretty interesting conversation with if they'll have their ears open to us. Um,
Yeah.
with that, I want to close out. I know, we're coming up on time here, but it's been awesome talking with you, Peter.
And you,
And
man, love this.
yeah, looking forward to continuing to follow the podcast, and hopefully we can keep in touch as we continue our respective journeys, and hopefully next time we talk, Bitcoin will be some freakish percentage higher than it is today.
Yeah, man. Well, listen, look, thanks for having me on. Really enjoyed this. It's great to talk to a fellow podcaster. Hear you going through or experiencing some of the same challenges, or having to think about some of the same things that I do. Anything I can ever do for you, just reach out to me, man.